To have a good harvest, one must plant good seeds and must also use the right kind of fertilizer. The carrots have grown large and firm. How good they will taste.
Well, welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast, everybody. It's a beautiful day. You got myself, Young Ben, and Batavia the Botanical here. The name has stuck. Thank you. Both ways. But we are, we go out and we talk to our garden, but did you know that your garden will talk to you? It'll give you signs, and we're going to break down all those signs of what your plants are telling you today. And I think you'll walk away with this, hopefully being able to recognize what your plants need. Do you recognize, Batavia, everything that your plant needs?
All of my plants.
How about that plant behind you? Do you know what it needs now?
Well, shoot. It needs to be returned to the store as if it was a recent purchase because, poor thing. It actually needs to be pruned and watered. Yeah. And, it's funny you say that because that's a plant inside of her house, everybody. But, I mean, it's the same thing for the plants outside. They're going to tell you, you just have to have, I would say, the ears to hear it, but the eyes to see it, I think. And maybe, if you're really good at hearing, you can hear the little plant screams every once in a while. But it's very important. But, before we get started, real quick, if you want to support the show, please check us out. Become an Apple subscriber or a patron. We have all of our fall seeds are available, as well as what's left of our other seeds. They're all in the link below, so check that out. And as we will get in later in the episode, we're going to tell you, but the Planter app as well. Check that out for a discount on that. All the links are below for that, and all of that goes to help support the show. So please help keep us on the air, because it is a machine that has to keep going. We have many, many gardeners to help out there in the world, and gardeners who will be out there soon. I mean, look, we're making this for the next generation, right? That's how I'm looking at it at this point. I have to leave something behind. I have to leave my mark. I don't have any direct offspring, and clearly this plant isn't going to be passed down to anyone in my family.
Don't give it to me. I'll kill it. Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing pretty good with my indoor plants.
I'm actually going to do an inventory, since we're at the beginning of summer, how many can actually make it to the fall. Summer is the toughest time in my house for indoor plants. They don't get any love.
Yeah, that's how it goes. Mine's the same way. But in the wintertime, I love them to death. Mm-hmm. And they don't even need it then. But, all right. So, I don't know. Where do you start with this? I think we should start at the basics and work our way to the difficult ones. And actually, now that this is an organic show, everybody. We have the topic plan, but not the way that it's going to go plan sometimes. But let's go by sign. So what a certain thing can break down and mean. So starting from the top, wilting. If you see a plant wilting in your garden, what does that mean? Because it doesn't just mean what you think it means. It can mean a lot of things.
Yeah, I think first stop and assess when you see the wilting, right? That's really important.
Look at you bringing the fire right off the bat. Look, we're going to have to end this show, everybody.
I'm telling you, I'm leaving on a high note, man.
You just left your mark.
Yeah, the time of day means everything.
It
right?
does.
So if you are out first thing in the morning and you see and I'm going to say this is probably across most climates, and you see a plant wilting, that Houston, you have a problem, right? Mm-hmm. Something that's midday could be different than if you observe the wilting in the latter part of the day. So if you break the day up into thirds, right? Morning wilting, which again, if it's wilting in the morning, it's not that it's really dehydrated. It's not that it's, trying to battle the heat of the day, which could be if it's further into the day. You probably have some type of insect, pest pressure, maybe disease. That's my take if you're looking at wilting. It doesn't mean that at 1 p.m. your time there's wilting, that it isn't that either. It could be.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at any point, if a plant is wilting, it could always mean underwatering. Mm-hmm. But that's when it's up to us to say, like, hey, when's the last time I watered? When's the last time it rained? Like, that's an easy thing to kind of, you know, you can check and see the soil content. But you're exactly right. Like, at what point of the day? Because, you know, you can go to your Googling machine and you can type in whatever plant, you know, is wilting in middle of day, and it'll tell you, you know, you can get an idea of what it could be. It doesn't, and it, just going with the starting from the bottom and working our way up, it doesn't have to be that only that you have underwatered it. It could mean there's a root issue, and that your plant literally does not have enough roots to sustain life. And so that could be part of it too, because it's not able to draw the water that it needs. So that could be a watering need, but it could also be a root issue. So, you know, that root nematodes, root knot nematodes, stuff like that, voles, moles, all that kind of stuff, just bad plant health. So that could be one aspect of it. Yeah. You saw this, was it 2 years ago now, in your tomatoes?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good point. Does your plant wilt, but then do you notice at some point it's bounced back? Right? Now that's tricky, because the trouble I had with my tomatoes 2 summers ago, it's, you know, it's hard to describe this without the visual. So there's like the limp leaf, like take a squash plant. The leaf itself.
I was going to say there's an elephant in the room and it's squash.
Or if you look at, by comparison, a tomato plant where there's almost a shriveling and a wilting that happens. Right. You know, so the shriveling and the wilting that happened with my tomato plants, they never recovered from that. Right. You know, and I initially managed it through like trying to prune, which, you know, was really a lost cause. The limpness sometimes that you see even in a squash plant. I've seen this recently in some of my sunflowers. You definitely see this depending on leafy greens that you may have in your garden. If you come back around on a kind of non-monumental heat day, so if, let's say, your temps to get back down to 70 degrees, you know, maybe 80 degrees in the evening.
That's wintertime. What you talking about?
If that plant has bounced back, then I feel like you're in a better place. You're not out of the woods, right? You know, so that just may be the heat of the day. That plant was overcome to a degree, but guess what? It still has some fight in it.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, you know, I want to take the second to talk about squash and just kind of get it out of the way with this. So that's usually it's a reaction to the heat of the day when only the leaf is kind of, I don't know how to explain this. It's like you have the stem for the leaf and then where the veins come out. Go ahead. Oh, you're doing signs. And then where the veins come out will kind of be firm, but then the long, soft leaf around it will wilt a little bit. It looks like it's wilting. That's a reaction to the heat. You come out in the evening or in the morning and it's back up, then it's coming, you know, that's just reaction to the heat. Yeah, it's rock strong, rock hard. And then if you come out and you have the stem, but then the whole leaf is wilted, you got squash vine borer.
Yeah.
And that's in the middle of the day, it'll do that. And but you have to really look at the base of that stem. And it's obvious, you'll be able to see it. Yeah. But it'll do the same thing. It'll rebound. And then it'll come back and it'll rebound and go back. And then that's how you know that, like, I have an issue. So I've got a Seminole pumpkin right now. It's growing out of my compost pile. And at this point, it's like 15 feet long, something crazy. Every day. It's never been watered by me, ever. We haven't had a drop of rain in 3 weeks. And it wilts all day. But then in the evening, you know, it comes back and it looks nice and pretty and strong. And so it's just this whole dynamic of the squash plant itself. But it's not really like that for other plants. Like, that's a standout situation, I think.
Yeah, I think that if we're sitting with squash for just a moment longer, squash or any plant, if you see wilting, try to take a look at the plant as a whole, right? You know, so by the time you get to day 2 of wilting from a squash plant, you're going to be able to look at the stem. Definitely day 3, you're going to be able to look at the stem. And if it's the little bastard squash vine borer, you're going to see where the damage is.
Yeah.
Right. You know, that gnawed up sawdust kind of look.
Yeah.
And my opinion has been, it's never bounced back after that. A plant's never bounced back. I did try 1 year through your recommendation, young Ben, to bury the stem because it was closer to the soil, and the plant didn't die, but it didn't produce a lot either.
Yeah, it kind of helps it limp it along, but I feel like at that point, it's, you know, you get the squash vine borer in there, man, it's basically a fatality.
Yeah. No.
You know, you've typed the code in, and it's a brutal fatality move at this point.
So I do think if you go back to the idea for any plant, you're looking at the plant in its entirety.
Yeah.
So I've seen, you know, things like tomato plants kind of get droopy is another way to describe it, you know. So not full on wilt, but maybe it's just a little bit droopy. If you look at other things around your garden, are they also droopy? That's also a good indicator where it could be the heat of the day, right? And everything in your garden, there's some things that are more obvious than others, but doesn't need immediate action, right? You know, I don't know. In the case of it's noon and things are drooping and you're not sure, would you, young Ben, water?
Well, I wouldn't have that issue of not being sure if it got watered, but if I put myself in that position, yeah, I absolutely would, because I've got news for you. You can water in the middle of the day and it will not burn your plants. Just so you know, it will not burn micro holes in your plants. It will not kill them. It'll be okay. It's a myth. We've covered it before. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you think for a second, like, hey, this is underwatered, 100% go water your plant. I mean, end of story. Don't even think twice about it.
Yeah, I'd try to water at the base in that case, because there is something with a wilting leaf. And if you get that too saturated, right, when that thing doesn't exactly, there's some burning that ends up happening. Not your plant has burned a hole in it, but that thing is weak. Like that cell structure has started to break down.
Yeah.
And now you have it wet, maybe sitting in some soil. So, you know, if you are going to water, which I would too. Like if I lost track of when I watered what, you know, put my hand in the soil, maybe some other things around it aren't limp, you know, it could just be that particular plant that took up more water. So yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, wilting is probably one of the things that we see so often, you know, as we get into the summer season, further into the summer season. Yeah.
And I mean, the wilting of underwatering is very noticeable. The plant, the leaf itself, just, it looks horrible. You know, it's very desiccated. It's not dry. It's almost like it's like a overly wet, saturated feeling to it. But there's just nothing in the flesh of the leaf. And at that point, it's in survival mode. But you could have a disease as well. Disease will make them go limp. I mean, last year in my green beans, I got the mosaic virus, and they went limp. They wilted, basically, and just died. And that's how I figured out what it was, is because I watered it, and nothing changed, and it wouldn't come back, and it was always wilted. And then the plants started dying one by one by one. So that allowed me to figure out, like, hey, there's more to the story than meets the eye. And that's exactly what happened, is there was a disease that killed it.
I pulled one of my volunteer potato plants. I came out one morning, again, not an overly warm morning. And when I looked, I noticed that it was one of many potato plants that was just completely, you know, curled over, you know, kind of just laying on the mulch. And I looked and said, you know, I yanked it. And to your earlier point, it really didn't have a real established root. You know, so I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I tossed it in my throwaway bag and kept on moving. Right. You know, so again, something that you see a problem with, and it's planted with like crops. That's also an indicator that it may be disease or some particular pest pressure, which in both cases, you really want to surveil the area, because it could just be it started with that one plant. Yeah.
And I mean, to put it out there, the typical diseases that will cause wilting is verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, nematode diseases, and bacteria wilts. So those are like your likely culprits for that. So just keep your eye out. If you see it, you can't identify it, just kind of dig a little deeper. And, again, once you get a disease, pull the plant. And that's why it's really important to listen to your plants and, see what they're telling you. Because then you go into, once we get out of wilting, then we go into discolorations. So, and there's, it's still, again, it's not as cut and dry as a discolor as, one would think. Typically, it's a nutritional disease or a nutritional imbalance, not disease.
I think that it could also be from overwatering.
Yep.
So I had this year, and I'm all but sure it was from overwatering. My sweet potato slips. So I'd actually put the majority of them in soil, and they had been on the back porch for quite a while because, clearly that's how I roll. You have to basically earn your spot to get to the next stage in my garden, it seems. And while there were some cooler nights, they were cooler by like getting down to 50 degrees. So I thought about it, tossed it over like, is this damage from the cold, right? Or is this damage
from the cool?
Yeah, good point. Cool weather. Or is this damage from overwatering? And I started to think back the number of mornings I came out where we were getting a lot of rain in May, and it was just sitting in the seed tray, which didn't have any holes in it.
Yeah.
And many hours, so, and if you think about this is happening 3 or 4 times a day. So it definitely could be overwatering, especially if you're managing the seedlings. You could have, if you're managing containers, how heavy is that container, right? Is that water really draining out? If you have a raised bed or an in-ground bed, do you have issues there with drainage? I think it's probably less likely, but I do definitely think it's possible that it could be from overwatering as far as the leaf, the discoloring.
Yeah, and to be exact with the watering issue, what it does is it suffocates roots and doesn't allow oxygen to get to it. So it will cause them to yellow. And it's basically what happens is when it can't get oxygen, it's not able to absorb the nutrients. So it starts dying off the older leaves and stuff like that. So that's what you got to really be careful about with overwatering. And containers, actually, I think containers are the easier ones to deal with because you can just stop watering and within a day or two, it'll start to come back. Go ahead. But when it comes to the whole garden, like an in-ground garden or a raised bed, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of correct it. So we just want to be careful with it. It depends on your soil makeup. So if you have a heavy soil, absolutely, if you have mulch, that's going to change how much you put into the ground or how much water it can retain. The time of day you're watering, the type of watering you're doing, for instance, I use a drip system now. So when you look at my garden, it always looks bone dry. But once I go down about an inch, then I start to feel the moisture and everything like that, which is where the roots are. So that was a learning curve for me because I'm like, I got to keep pump the water. And then it turns out that it's not really ever getting wet because there's no rain hitting it, especially right now. So, keeping an eye on what's happening under the top inch or so of soil will really help with you within the process.
Yeah, I think that a very common mistake is looking at that very top level of the soil. I'm trying to think. This happened with a passerby, and this is before I got to the point in the season of adding some mulch, and they commented about how dry my garden was. This is in the front yard garden, and it was like, yeah, the very top level is dry, right? But go down a half an inch. Yeah. And it's not. I do also want to go back to things that can cause issues with your roots absorbing that oxygen. Heavier soil, right? This is one of the key mistakes that we sometimes make as container gardeners where, you're putting in strictly topsoil, or your soil makeup is just generally heavy based on whatever you've created. Potting soil that you purchase, you generally don't have that kind of issue. Potting mix you purchase, you don't have that kind of issue. But if you're like me, you start to mix up your own combinations. You have to be careful of that. We're past this point for y'all, but since we're here, I just want to stay here for a second. I find that with my Chicago winters, some containers will absorb more water through all the snow than others. And it takes longer for them to dry out. So drainage holes, it's a good example of making sure you have the proper amount and size of drainage holes. If you have not had issues with your regular in-ground beds or, your in-ground garden in years past when it comes to water pooling, unless you've gotten much more rain, that's probably not what's happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so in the late fall and the winter and even early spring, I don't water my containers at all. Nothing, not one drop goes in there because they don't need it. Especially the more mature the plant gets. But kind of piggybacking off that is, nutrient deficiencies. So that's called, it's the technical term for it is called chlorosis. Chlorosis is a technical term for it. And that's just when the leaves start turning yellow, which usually means that it is a nitrogen deficiency. And so this goes hand in hand with watering, because what do we know about nitrogen, everybody? That's right, you said it.
It's water soluble.
It's water soluble, so you can wash it out of your garden. So you need to be continuously, to some extent, adding some kind of nitrogen. Like if you go get a soil test, almost 100% of the time they're going to say add nitrogen, because it gets washed out. So just if you see yellowing of the leaves, you haven't been overwatering, give it some fertilizer, and that will help kick it back in. If you're using a synthetic fertilizer, fine, it's going to kick in immediately. If it's an organic, you kind of need to be on a little bit of a schedule because it takes time for it to break down. But and the way you can really tell if it is going to be because of the nitrogen deficiency, or the older leaves will turn yellow, then the newer leaves will start to turn yellow as well. And that's when because it's passing the buck on. So again, the plant's always going to sacrifice the older leaves, and then it will go into the newer leaves, because that's the nature of survival for it.
And simply put, if you're adding some type of nitrogen, and then you see those leaves shift back to a more green state, then that was your answer. I had this issue with my cucumber starts. I started them by seed, and they looked beautiful. Then they sat on my deck, because again, that's where plants live for quite a while. I planted them out knowing that they were yellow. And I, for that next week, kept an eye on them. I planted them and added some fish fertilizer, and the cucumber seeds that I direct sowed came up, and it was such a reminder of how green the plants really are supposed to be. So it's a good example of, as I continue to feed over the next, if those things don't bounce back within 7 to 10 days, then there's something else happening.
You can almost, if you use the right kind of fertilizer, you can almost, not instantly, but garden instantly, a day or two. You can really start to notice it. I've seen it many, many, many times. And I want to take a second here and talk about this. So it's nutrient deficiencies, but it can also be fertilizer burn. So you've used too much. And so what that does is it's pulling the moisture up out of the roots to kind of help that plant survive. This is I want to take this as a moment to talk about fertilizers. So if you're having this issue, remember, like for me, for instance, on my garden, I am primarily organic. As a matter of fact, I think I've only used a non-organic fertilizer maybe like once or twice in this garden, which this garden here is coming at 7 years old. And I've been gardening for almost 20 years now. And I think only 2 or 3 times have I ever used synthetic. But if you have this issue, this is a good time to maybe think about using a synthetic fertilizer. You just have to be careful not to burn with it. So just follow the directions. Don't freak out. Just follow the directions. But on the same token, Batavia hit the nail on the head when she said she used fish fertilizer. It's organic, but the thing is because it's a liquid, it almost instantly hits the plants and it gives it that initial boost. And it can, to be in all honest, I think that it can really help that plant make it to the next feeding, like give it enough of a boost, because you can give it, 1 to 2 feedings of that within the 2 to 3 week period it will take for your organic fertilizers to kick in. So you could give it a feeding on this Thursday, and then the next time you hear the podcast, give it another feeding, and then that will help you to kind of push it to the next, till that other one kicks in. So, and because they're so light as well, they're not real heavy fertilizers. I'm a big proponent of fish fertilizers. I don't care what brand you use. That doesn't matter. I just think that it works really well and it's perfect for this. And not to mention, if you also you feed it, you water it, but then you do like a foiler feeding with it where you're putting a watering can, it will also absorb. If you do it early in the morning, it will absorb through the leaves and then help it get it in there even faster. So I wouldn't primarily do it that way if you're having this issue, but it's a good, mix up a batch, spray it through your hose or use your watering can there, but then take a little bit and just wet the leaves with it as well, because that will help push it. So just to kind of a shout out about fertilizers in general, that's really, I think, the way to kind of maximize that. But I hesitate for people. I hate it when people are just so anti-synthetic fertilizer, when in fact you could give it a dose and totally reverse this issue completely and then go back to your organic methods. I think that's the way to go personally if you're having this issue, either one of those. But just keep that in mind and use it to your advantage. But just be careful with synthetic, because you can burn it. It's hard to burn with organic. You got to really try to burn a plant with organic fertilizer.
Yeah, I think if we could take just a beat and acknowledge that we oftentimes talk about a single problem or a single crop, and good on you guys for keeping track of all of this, because by the time we get to the heat of the summer, when you guys are listening to this particular episode, you're fighting and batting. Now it's like whack-a-mole, There are multiple things that are happening here. And we always talk about, pest management, and if you're treating your garden, and the frequency you need to come in at, right? It's something that you have to keep track of. And what you just described, Young Ben, when it comes to, that fertilizer treatment to try to resolve an issue, right? It's less about being proactive. You have to kind of keep your eye on that from a timing perspective as well, right? Yeah.
And you don't have to wait for a plant to yellow to say, hey, it could be a lighter green color. And then you can say, hey, you know what? It's time for me to go ahead and add my fertilizer. Yeah. And at that point, you could just shoot at some of that fish fertilizer to kind of help it along. And that's really, I think, we often talk about as a gardener, and the more experience you get, the more you can recognize things. And I think this is one of those things where you can recognize hey, my plant doesn't look as green as it used to. Let me give it a little something, or hey, I need to fertilize soon. I think, cause I don't want to say the damage is done once it yellows, but it definitely sets the plant back. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
I think also take, an assessment of the circumstances. So I know, if I look back to same idea of it being overly watered in those pots, it's sitting there and having literally no nutrition in those seed cells. And it's been battling those cucumber starts. It's been battling, the elements, right? So in that case, my best decision is to get it in the ground, get it planted. If this was a container that was already established, I need to take a different approach here. If now all of a sudden I'm getting leaves that are yellowing. Yeah. So, I think that you want to kind of make a note of the circumstances this is happening in, because that's going to influence the approach you're taking.
Yeah. And if you need guidance on fertilizers to use and stuff like that, you can check out the Amazon list below. It's got all of our gardening stuff that we use in our gardens. And so that's the stuff that we recommend. It's an affiliate link, so it'll help us with whatever you buy, no extra cost to you. But that stuff really does help, because, and going into the next portion of this, which excuse me, Batavia kind of, she kissed it a little bit there, is pests. Pests can also discolor your leaves, believe it or not. What they're doing, and usually the yellowing of the leaf is by small pests like mites, aphids, stuff like that. They're basically sucking the life out of your plant, the sap. So this will help with that too. That'll help discoloration. The difference is what you're going to see in your plant leaves is you're going to see splotches of yellowing, or typically, like, especially if you have mites or something, what you'll see is it'll start with the edges of the leaves turning yellow. I'm drawing with my hand in the air just so you guys can know, so you guys can imagine like I am. And then what will end up happening after that from the edge on, as that yellowing grows down the plant more, and again, shout out to the squash plant because it's very common, you'll start to see it die back on top of that. And that is an indication that you have some kind of pest, like again, mites. And mites are, I don't like having, I haven't had a lot of mites in my garden, but I've had them on my bonsai trees before. And when I get mites, I basically immediately treat for them. The best way to check for that is get a white piece of paper. Just get a piece of printer paper or notebook paper, hold it under the leaf and shake it. And when you do, you'll see little red mites walking around on the paper. That means you have mites, clearly. So that can lead to it.
Not uncommon for houseplant lovers.
No,
That's one, as an aside, not related to outdoor gardening. Why one of the many reasons why people isolate new plants when they bring them into their home.
Yep. Or just immediately treat them.
So there's some folks that have the routine that says, when you enter my home, this is what's going to happen with you as a new plant.
Yep. And so mealy bugs are another one. Aphids are one. Flea beetles can cause it, but they give you other indications as well. So just keep on note with that. And if you do get that damage, then see, this is all a cycle. If you do start to get the damage and you get it under control, then feed it afterwards and give that plant the nutrition it needs to rebuild. Just like if you were to go to the gym and work out, you got to eat that protein. Well, basically the nitrogen is the protein. And so you're going to give it that protein so it can rebuild its muscles and get it back going in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that for so far the things we've talked about, you also have to make some decisions about when pruning is needed and when it isn't.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some, I do, when it comes to Japanese beetles, as an example of, it doesn't give you discoloration necessarily. You're going to see some leaf damage. It starts to look more Skeletor-like. I tend to leave those leaves in place. I don't typically prune them because if I can stay on top of hand picking the Japanese beetles, then I want that leaf to remain. I want those leaves to remain. But in some cases, clip. It's just, sometimes it's just simpler. It doesn't mean that because you cut it doesn't mean that the problem's gone away. Yeah, which goes back to the overall view of the plant.
On the note of pruning, I want to be very clear on my stance of it. You don't want to go out and prune every day. You want to go out and say, hey, there's a problem. You want to prune at once and treat at once. Just go ahead and get it all done, then let the plant recover and get on a treatment regimen if you have some kind of pest. Like that's, if you plant it every day, I mean, imagine taking your arm and just doing like a paper cut every day. Eventually you'd be like, damn, I'm tired of getting this paper cut all the time. And so it's the same idea. It'll drive your plant crazy. So just try and get all the pruning done at once. And it is, if you have a leaf that's like crazy damage, green beans, I don't really ever prune like anything away from because there's just so many leaves. But again, squash leaves, tomato plants, melons, stuff like that. Like it can benefit you to go ahead and pull those highly damaged leaves off so that the plant's not focusing on regrowing and pulling energy from a quarter of a leaf or something like that. It just kind of helps the plant along, but just don't do it every day. Be like, okay, well today I'm going to take this leaf. There's more damage on the next day. And don't do that. That's not a good method to go by.
Yeah, I do prune And it's more of just not even pruning. It's not the act of pruning. It's cutting a couple of leaves when it comes to my green bean plants, pole beans mostly. If there's damaged leaves, if there's yellowing, especially because it starts a lot of times just the natural progression at the bottom of the plant. And I will prune some of my cucumber leaves, not the, I should describe that as cutting as well. Not the idea of like, some people are like doing single vines for cucumbers, but that's a different conversation. So I will clip away those things. Pruning or even real cuts, I try to manage when the weather is the coolest for whatever time of year you're at. When it's not sunny. Overcast is a great day to do that. Back in June, we had the first heat wave here in Chicago, a blistering 90 degrees for 5 or 6 days in a row. And I decided to wait on the other side of that to do my first pruning of like that bottom 1 foot of my tomato plants. They were tall enough to get pruned. However, there's no sense in injuring that plant when it's already quite literally fighting, when it comes into that heat. So that's something you also want to consider, the timing of what you're doing from a pruning perspective. And I'm only pruning those kind of things like a couple of times throughout the season, maybe 3 times out of the season at most. It's the initial haircut for some of these, tomato plants. And then maybe it's once more, but it's, more like spot pruning.
Yeah. Now there's 2 more big ones for yellowing leaves, and both of them are very quick, but one of them is sunlight. So if you're getting too little sunlight, then you're going to get yellowing leaves as well. So that means that, a lot of times you'll get other indications as well. Like your plant will be stretching, it'll be leaning in one direction, trying to reach the sunlight. So, you can clearly there's ways to, it's really hard in a garden to do it. You have to remove tree branches, basically, or remove your garden. But what that plant will do is it will start dropping and yellowing its older leaves to give the new ones the place to kind of get as much sunlight as possible to survive. So just keep an eye out for that. But like I said, and on the list would not be, we don't have on the list like plants leaning or anything like that, because really that means 2 things. One, it's looking for sunlight, or it's wind blown. That's really about it. So and you can tell, like, if you think you have sunlight issues, you probably have sunlight issues, like, end of story. So just kind of keep your eye out for that. But the last one is soil pH. So a soil that is let me get this right, alkaline, will cause yellowing leaves as well. Yes, alkaline. But there's going to be other indications as well throughout the season. So what are your thoughts about a home pH test?
So I think that there are a lot of things that are sold, that aren't necessarily quality. I did some testing recently on quality of water, like sink water, faucet water. And I ultimately said, well, let me just taste this. And I said, okay, yeah, this is off, right? And the solution was to get a filter for it. That's a different conversation. I think you're better off getting a soil test that you're sending off to a reputable company or university than purchasing, the $15 or $20 pH test from, your home improvement store. Mm-hmm. I've never done one, to be fair, when it comes to the, testing your pH level in your soil, but I don't think I'm a believer.
So 1 year I did both. I sent off and had the state do a soil test for me, included a pH test. And then I was curious and got my own pH test and did it myself. Mm-hmm. And what I learned was the one that you buy from the store is a piece of crap, and it's not worth it's not worth any money at all. You just flush it down the toilet. It was so hard to read, so subjective it was not worth the effort to put it in. The whole shebang, because when you do a soil test, like my state extension does them, and if you do it at the right time of year, it's free, and if you don't, it's like $1 a soil test or something. But because I have raised beds, I treat each individual one as its own garden, so I'll send off 11, 12 soil tests. It's included in there, the pH test. So just keep that. And there's people that will say, like, hey, just add lime every year and do that. Like, I don't recommend doing that, because you could, once you get it to alkaline, or I can't remember which one it was, but it's hard to correct it once you go over a certain amount. So you have to start adding sulfur in your garden, which basically means your garden smells like farts. So I don't recommend doing that, but just make sure you're getting a quality test. Long story short. And then the last one are like holes in your leaves, and plant death, clearly. But that's obviously going to be a pest. And it's, usually you can see it. So I don't think we should really cover like Japanese beetles, because you can see Japanese beetles. You can see tomato hornworms, stuff like that. But you start getting into like flea beetles, pickle worms, the moth worm, all that stuff, cabbage moths and stuff like that. You start to see like holes in your leaves. And this is when it's important to know what plant you're growing and what pests can attack them.
And I think when you're growing that plant, right, because some pests are more prominent in certain times in the garden than others. I feel like a lot of us are home gardeners, but there are other folks that are in community garden spaces. And if you're not in your garden every day, it's very possible to come back to damage, right? And not necessarily see the culprit. Poop, so little black dots of something, oftentimes is the poop of one of the pests that Ben mentioned. That's a good indicator that the holes you're seeing are the result of some bug eating, army worms and things of that nature. Leaf damage is one thing, but when you start to see damage with actual fruit of the plant, that's another, right?
Yep.
So if there's one, there's probably 6 or 7 or 10, right?
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, you got a hole in a tomato, you got army worm. You got a hole in your leaf of your cabbages, your brassicas, you've got a worm. When you go to treat for worms, use BT or spinoside. And if you've got little holes in stuff like eggplants, okra, what else have I personally seen them on? That's about
It's a beetle of some sort, yeah.
It's flea beetle. Sweet potatoes, and you see like a lot of little holes in them. That's what you have. Do a couple treatments of neem oil on a 7 to 10 day schedule, and you'll take care of them. Keep an eye. You got holes in your cucumbers. You got the pickle worm. So again, that one's kind of harder to treat, because they get inside of the pickle worm, or inside of the cucumber. So you've got to continuously be treating. But, just keep an eye out for that stuff. And again, we went over the mites and stuff like that earlier. I use neem oil for that. Or sometimes you can even start with some of these little ones with just like soapy water, because that'll desiccate the skin just like it does your hands when you do the dishes. So just think about that moving forward as you get into your garden. But those are like... That's the way your plants are talking to you. So one thing that I know is when you get into this and you start, and let's say you don't really know what pests will really bother a certain plant. This is where we get into talking about the Planter app, because in that app, excuse me, they have a section about pests that can potentially harm a plant. So you can check that as you're making your plans, or you can reference it coming back. Say, hey, what is this on my tomato? And you go back and you look and you can see a list broken down within that app that will tell you what's wrong with your plants, what could be affecting you. And then you can use your knowledge on top of that. Like we just said, if it's a caterpillar of some sort, you can use a BT. You can use a spinoside. If it's not, if it's a hard-bodied insect, you can use neem oil. You can use, what's it called? I can't remember. Poly something. The chrysanthemum oil from the mum plant. You can use that. You can use Seven Dust, if you don't care about going organic. So, using that will help determine which way you can go. And it also helps you make a good solid plan to get you going, especially as we ramp up, start talking more about fall gardening and stuff like that. You can definitely use it. It's available in the Google and Apple stores. You can use it on your PC, your phone, your tablet, whatever you want. There's a link below that gets you a good discount. And look, like I said before, if you don't think you're going to like it or you're questioning it, sign up for the free version of it. And then once you figure out you like it, go get the subscription. You're going to like it. Trust me. It definitely is. It's been a game changer for us. And that's the Planter app, the Planter app. And it's available on the Google and Apple Play stores. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit extra time on today's question of the day. So we're actually going to have two. One, both of these come from the Facebook group. So that's the Backyard Gardens Community Garden, and you can come check it out and join the community there. Tracy asks, are cover crops absolutely necessary?
Hey, Tracy.
And just to make this one simple, Amy then comes back and says, hey, check out the May 23rd episode. So,
thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And if you are curious about it, definitely check out that episode. We are playing around with cover crops and we've dove into them, but I just wanted to kind of shout that one out. And then the other one is, I said I had it picked out and then I lost it. Oh, never mind. Jillian writes, this is the real question of the day. Do you start most of your fall seeds inside? What is the best way to manage space and the transition? Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Hey, Jillian.
And yeah, go ahead.
Come on.
We
can't get this synced up. Good grief. You think she's going to say long-time listener, and I'm not going to say thanks for listening? We appreciate you.
Well,
come on, you know that.
I was going to bring it up and say, where does the first-time caller come from?
That's like a radio bit.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, long-time listener for when radio stations would take callers, listener calls and stuff.
Man, it's been a long time since I listened to the radio.
Yeah, I'm going to say that answer proudly. You're not going to age shame me because I clearly remember a time when, calling into the radio station was all of the things.
Do y'all have Bojangles up there?
No.
My wife, she won 2 Bojangles biscuits the other day on the radio going to work. She said she was so nervous when they called and she could hear herself on the radio. But, yeah. So anyways, do you start your fall seeds inside? I wanted to point this one out because I'm kind of playing around with this one a little bit this year. We talked about it in a previous episode.
Yeah, so my intention, listen to my words very carefully, is to start my fall seeds inside. That was as of mid-June. I decided on that. I was going to do a split of, some inside and then some outside. I just don't know if I'm going to be able to adequately manage it that way.
Yeah, I typically start them inside. The issue that I have is where I start them inside is actually warmer inside, so they struggle. Long story short, with the heat inside, believe it or not. But then I started them outside last year, just kind of messing around, and they did pretty good. So it's getting down to the wire now, and I've got to make a decision. I don't know what I want to do. I think I want to start some of them outside, and hopefully maybe the majority of them. The problem is going to be keeping them watered. That's going to be really, really hard, and I don't know if I really feel like dealing with it.
That's what I mean when I say I'm not sure if I can manage both of them. Yeah. I've literally whined about I'm back in the grill room and I turned all those lights off. But I'm actually looking forward to giving some of these fall crops a try, especially some of the ones that I've been challenged with, because I know it's cooler in the space where I'm starting seeds, where when I'm in January, February, March, I'm rocking and rolling. My house is humming along. It's warm. But now it's generally going to be cooler. And so my hope is that it's going to have a more positive effect. And it will be nice, to be honest. I didn't think I'd say this, but to get back to a routine of it.
Yeah.
Quiet as kept, my treadmill is down there, and Lord knows. I need to spend a few moments in the morning on it. But all seriousness, what impacts whether you're starting them inside is what your setup is. Did your family threaten you when you had your seedlings on the dining room table with the light suspended in the air? Is that not as natural for you now as we get into July and August for your seeds starting? Is it a place that is temperature controlled? Right. Yeah. I think that is something to consider inside versus outside, where is your garden area in complete sun? Right. Is that good or bad for these fall crops? Probably not the most ideal if you have heat and sun trying to get those started. Seedlings do bolt. Someone commented on this recently in a video of mine, like, to my surprise. And I'm like, the first time it happened to me, I was surprised too.
Yeah. I mean, they do bolt, but are they easy to bolt? That's the question, because when you start growing broccoli and stuff like that, they bolt really quickly. Mm-hmm. But my question becomes, and I have to think about it like this. If you plant broccoli, and let's just say no human touch, let's say a broccoli seed falls, hits the ground, and then it grows, it bolts, it creates seed, and then it drops on the soil, it's going to replant itself again for the fall, right? And it's going to grow when the time is appropriate. And then it'll either bolt and drop again, or it's going to create a head of broccoli. So my question is, does it really make that big of a difference? And I don't know where I stand on that right now, because typically all I've ever done is start seeds inside. And last year I kind of played around with it. I started them in deep shade, and they seem to do pretty well. And these weren't the sensitive ones. I think it was like chard, maybe, turnips, stuff like that. I didn't do, broccoli, stuff that's really easy to bolt. Like cabbages are biennial, for instance. So my thought process is, if it's a biennial, then what you have to do is trick the plant in thinking that it's been 2 years in the ground, which is a hot and cold cycle. Well, if you're starting in the heat, and it grows, and then it doesn't get cold until it gets cold, but it's not going to get hot again, then it should be fine. So I think I'm going to start my cabbages outside, but I'm not going to start my broccoli outside. Does that make sense? Well,
because broccoli is more likely to bolt than cabbage is. So
because it's not a biennial.
If that's the scheme, then yeah, that makes sense. I think that I don't think that that's the only reason why it's more likely to bolt, because it's a biennial. I 2 years ago started some kale, maybe collards, but definitely kale, a couple of different varieties outside. I tried to put them in a kind of an area that got full sun at some point, but it got pockets of shade, right? And one of the challenges was managing it being leggy, right? So I tried to counter the idea of this plant is, these seed trays are in full sun by giving it a little bit of shade, and guess what? They're reaching for that sun, because that's what plants do. I think not only the sun, but it's just plainly put the heat, right? So I don't think that when I was tempted to do it, and who knows, because I love a good garden experiment, I was going to do your favorite, kind of winter sowing method, putting them in some jugs without
That's
silling
not my favorite.
them. Yeah, I know. That's the sarcasm.
Oh, okay.
Putting them in jugs without silling them, but you also have that greenhouse effect. I've seen people do this. Let me stop and say that, depending on what they're growing. Seen people do this, but there's even more heat that's being introduced to anything that's within it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a balance. For me, the vast majority of seeds that I'm going to be sowing for winter, including all of my leafy greens, unless it's a root crop, I'm going to first do a batch of seeds indoors. So that includes my lettuces, trying kale again, a couple of more cooler variety kales. That's not the way I wanted to say that. A couple of more hardy, like winter type varieties of kale. Although kale generally is pretty hardy. Some collards, your, broccoli, cabbage again. So I'm trying all of those for fall. And I say try again, just based on some of the challenges. I'm trying them early enough where if I run into some of the troubles that I personally, not most gardeners, but I personally have had, I still have time to direct sow some of those in my climate too. So there is that.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, broccoli is a biennial. So
I didn't say that it wasn't. I said
I said it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
I'm calling myself out. I'm correcting myself.
No, you said that broccoli was a biennial, and that's the reason why it bolts compared to cabbage, which the implication was cabbage wasn't a biennial.
Oh, I thought I said it the other way around. Well, either way, it's a biennial. So yeah, I'm looking at it now, and I think to myself, like, clearly a farm does fall crops, right? But they direct sow their crops in the summertime to go through. I mean, where are they going to keep, a couple 100,000 broccoli plants, until they plant in the fall? So this is something that I'm playing around with. It's a good question. I think the answer is, if you want to be safe than sorry, start them inside. But just understand that you're going to have to be very careful about hardening them off, getting them used to the heat. And then also, no matter what, when you go to plant them, keeping them cool when you plant them out, that's going to be the kicker. And that's just adding shade is all that is to it. I mean, you can't do anything else other than that, unless you want to go out there and put ice on them every day. But the
cool and watered.
Yeah, because the fall soil is much drier than the spring. So, I mean, if you think about it, in spring, typically the soil is always moist. So you're going to have to up your watering. And that's something I'm going to do this year. For instance, right now, I water every 3 days, but when I go to plant my fall crop, especially the majority of them, I'm going to switch to every 2 days, because those plants naturally need more water. So
I do want to, what I believe to be the truth about your garden, I do want to acknowledge this, and this is most times the truth about my garden. You're putting your fall plants into one or more beds, right? You're doing less tucking them in spaces, right?
Yeah, I totally replant all beds. Yeah.
So that's very important when you think about kind of planting those plants and then what you're doing from a watering perspective, versus if I have I don't have it, but an 8-foot by 4-foot bed like yours. And I have half of it's already planted with other things. And then you have these young seedlings coming in. So it doesn't mean that if that's your setup that you shouldn't do that. It's just keep an eye out for my favorite topic around this time of year, plants that get shaded out. Right. And the watering needs of the new versus the old.
Yeah. And so that's a big reason why I went to monocropping each bed. And to be totally honest and transparent, I think that is one of the most unpopular things I do in my garden. Meaning I get a lot of comments about, like, I would never do that. I don't, and I get that people like that, the different varieties and beds and stuff like that. But when it comes to going back and replanting stuff like this, it makes it so much easier, because everything is controlled. Everything from the amount of water to the fertilizer to the pests to the temperature, everything that it needs is definitely controlled. And so that's why I have switched to that method, and I really do enjoy it. So, but I am very aware that of all the things I do, it is one of the most unpopular things I do.
It's funny because I've done it for a number of years out of convenience.
Yeah.
Right. And I cringe a little bit every time you say it, which is wild because it's the way I grow my garden almost, exclusively. And I cringe just because of the negative connotation associated with monocropping.
Yeah.
Right. It absolutely works for me in my garden space. It helps me manage things. Right. There are some downsides as it relates to even during the season. If there's something specific if I have a cabbage worm that's attacking my cabbage bed, guess what's going to happen?
Yeah.
If I had some other crops in that bed, the impact by that cabbage worm is limited to the cabbage-like crops, right? Versus, most everything is a free-for-all. But that's a small price to pay because I'm taking other steps to manage that. And then obviously there's the impact on the soil and the lack of diversity. But again, I think you just have to sometimes make what could be perceived as harder decisions to get what you need out of your garden. So I'm with you. We're monocropping brothers and sisters.
There you go.
You're wearing it big and bold on your chest, and I'm whispering it like, yeah.
I don't have a choice, though. It's plain as day when you look at the garden, So, but if you'd like to be like Jillian and you'd like to send in a question, you can do so. We have an email address below, which is bygquestion. It's singular because somebody else has questions. At gmail.com. There's a link below. So definitely do that. That's our preferred method, but we will always take them. And I put out posts periodically asking for questions on the Backyard Gardens Community Garden on Facebook, which you are free to join. If you are listening and you think, hey, bygquestion@gmail.com is a great way to market my article about tulips, don't waste your time. It's only for the listeners, and it is only for the question of the day. Thank you. If you would like to contact us for any other way, you can find another email address, which I'm not going to put out here, but you got to do your research. So I just recently got one about, we keep getting them every year about the orchid show. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do anything about an orchid show. I don't care about your article. I'm sorry, everybody. This is for the listeners. So check that out. And, we do appreciate it because it's a good question. It really is a good question. And it's something to be thought about and really considered when you're going and starting your third season garden. So, you want to be successful and you only get one shot at it when you're starting seeds. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And fall is like, there's a cutoff point and it's hard and fast. So thank you. And we will be talking more. There's a lot of questions that are geared around fall, so we will be starting to drip those on you guys. But that being said, I hope you guys continue to listen to your plants and what they're saying now, and you can hear them loud and clear. And remember this. As a gardener and a listener to the Backyard Gardens podcast, a watcher of Sandy Bottom Homestead and Be Better Garden, we always do two things here. We learn to grow, but we also grow for change. We also sing, I want to be like Jillian. See ya.
Now you know why people feel like celebrating at harvest time.
All over the world, people have feasting and good times when the crops have been gathered in.
Thanks for checking out the show. If you like what we're doing and you'd like to support us, you can become a patron at patreon.com/backyardgardens, or you can be an Apple subscriber, and in both of those, you'll get an extra episode every month. You can also make a one-time PayPal donation with the link below, and you can get all kinds of gardening gear like t-shirts and mugs and cups from the link below at Teespring, and we have an Amazon store which has all the products that we use and recommend in our gardens, and it helps support our show. And we also add to this list periodically, so be sure to check it out periodically to see if there's anything that you need for your garden. Everything that you do, including a like and a subscribe and even a review, will help us learn to grow and grow for change.
See ya.